Sometimes knowing the right decision to make is about knowing what decisions you shouldn't make. We're looking at that through the lens of the Dolphins and the 2024 NFL Draft here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tip of the cap to our everydayers, because it is your team every day. We don't just say it. We live it here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase on last-minute tickets. Lowest prices guaranteed. NFL draft-centric show coming your way. We do also have the NFL rule changes that have been approved at the NFL owners' meetings. Kickoff changes, trade deadline. We'll get into some of that towards the end of the show. But I want to keep this centric on the NFL draft to start. And specifically, the Dolphins, are, as things currently stand, have a first-round pick and a second-round pick. And those two selections for the Dolphins, the aspirations should be to find players that are able to come into your program and be contributors quickly, not Cam Smith-type players, not Channing Tindall-type players that had developmental learning curves in some of those positions. It's just a natural part of the game. And that is going to come up again as we talk about some of these positions. But there's so much focus on what do the Dolphins draft? And you have a whole bevy of team needs. You have a whole roster with various contract commitments. And I think sometimes the discussion of what you should do becomes easier when you narrow the scope first. That's how the NFL teams approach this draft process. They look at disqualifiers. What are the disqualifiers that would take you off of our consideration to invest premium asset into you and bring you into our program? And I think the first portion of identifying what positions need to be avoided, the analogy is it's a three-dimensional conversation, just like we talked about yesterday when we were talking about paying Odell Beckham. There's the player itself, there's the cost of the player, but then the third dimension is the chain reaction and how it affects the rest of the team. And some of the third dimension conversations for certain players at certain positions is where you kind of lose me, because like you could draft a good player, but if that player is coming in and it overlaps too much with the role that currently exists, then it gets redundant, which brings us to addressing versus investing. And I think what this Dolphins regime has done is they have shown us to this stage where they want to invest. And investing means it's very difficult to over-invest in the things that you have identified as these are going to be the defining qualities of our team. You address your needs. And I think for a lot of Dolphins fans, some of the frustrations for weak points along the roster have been, we want you to invest in this group, offensive line. We don't want you to address this group. We want an investment. And in some cases, the Dolphins have shown a willingness to do that. It seems like center, between the Connor Williams contract at 2 years, $14 million total, and the Aaron Brewer contract at 3 years, $21 million total. They have an investment range that they're comfortable with at center. And it's not top of market dollars. They are investing in offensive tackle. They are addressing the other spots and the depth of the unit. You go through the draft history of Chris Greer, you get a lot of pass rushers, corners, offensive tackles, wide receivers. That's where they like to invest into this roster. It's the identity of this roster. Now, there's areas that you could change how you want to invest. I think tight end is a very pertinent position to bring up here. The team brought in Jody Fortson and the team brought in Jonnu Smith to the tight end room versus what it was last year. And they've kind of been looking for acorns at tight end with Tanner Connor and then Julian Hill, and just seeing if they can find a guy who's going to pop. Well, they brought in a few other names, and I'll spoil it for when we get into positions I would avoid. I'd have a really hard time drafting a tight end that's not Brock Bowers in the first 2 rounds of the first 2 days of this NFL draft. As you think of it from a 3-dimensional conversation. You've brought in players that address what you don't have. You didn't have a guy who could detach from the set and run routes. Well, that could be Jody Fortson if he's healthy. And Jonnu Smith is a movable piece who can hit 21 miles per hour with the ball in his hands. Run after catch, angular blocker, not necessarily a high-end inline blocking type. But that's okay because the Dolphins' blocking scheme, so much for tight ends, is rooted in angles and getting up onto the second level and cutting across the formation where we bake the angles in for you. If you were to bring in another tight end, that would make it you would be investing in the tight end room. And unless you're going to change your ideology versus what the tight end room has been to a significant degree, not just, hey, we need to be more balanced, unless you're going to come out and say, hey, we're going to be predominantly a 12 personnel team, that would be a disqualifier for me from drafting a tight end, especially when you consider the tight end position in general is a position where many guys come into the league and they have to relearn how to do everything, whether they are pass catchers or whether they are blockers. Durham Smythe talked about as much this past training camp, talking about how I came in the league. I thought my blocking was my strength. It took me like 4 years to relearn how to block at the NFL level. I like Jatavian Sanders. I just did a story on this over on Substack, my Substack, which is Touchdown Miami. You can check it out if you're interested, and you can subscribe. But I do long form written content there. And Jatavian Sanders is a name who is linked to the Dolphins often. I know the Dolphins, it seems like they really like Jatavian Sanders. But the overlap between what he would do well versus what Jonnu Smith has proven at an NFL level to do is too dramatic. And Sanders as a blocker has too much of a developmental curve for the opportunity cost of you're not really invested in the tight end room historically. So unless you're going to dramatically change what you are, investing in that room with a player with a developmental curve who has a lot of overlap with a player who you've already brought in and has proven to have taken to the developmental curve and learned how to be an angular and space blocker in the NFL, it's not going to be for me. I wouldn't draft a tight end not named Brock Bowers in the first 2 rounds or in the first 2 days. First, second, and third round. The Dolphins currently don't have a third round pick. I'd love to see them change that. But that's setting the table of where have the Dolphins proven to you time and time again with this brain trust, this football regime, they are invested in having the identities of their offense and defense. That is going to tell you in a lot of ways where I think the appropriate places are to continue to be strong, have a long-term plan, have long-term stability, which means there's going to be position groups that we can kind of just cross off the list and say, look, whether it's the strength of the class, whether it's the Dolphins' tendencies themselves, whether it's the scheme that they run, whether it's the opportunity cost that's too great versus only a marginal improvement, they're not going to be positions that I would consider. And, we talk about drafting for need being a dangerous game to play. But if you can eliminate, and look, if there's a player who's on the board and they're obviously head and shoulders the best available talent, yeah, you're going to have a hard time not drafting that player. But I think with how this draft class is stacking up, I find it very difficult to envision there's going to be a head and shoulders player at one of those positions that the Dolphins choose to address versus invest in. That would be so much better than every other option that the conversation would be open and shut. Yeah, we need to break all of our tendencies and draft this player instead. So we'll talk about the other position groups that I'm a little leery on and would be on my short list to not address early when you're seeking early contributors to your roster. Here next on Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. Say goodbye to buying tickets without the stress With Gametime, the only ticketing app that gives you complete peace of mind with your purchase. You can see this view from your seats before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you roll up to the stadium or the arena. And all-in prices show you your total up front, so you know you're getting a great deal before you check out. No surprise processing fees or extra charges with Gametime, and you can buy tickets in just seconds with a few taps on your phone. They're obsessed with finding you ways to save money on tickets. They have tickets and deals right up to the start of the event, even an hour after the event starts. It is the place to find last-minute tickets for football, basketball, baseball, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON, LOCKEDON, for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. So as you go through the depth chart, there's been a lot of buzzy, I guess, mock draft conversation around the Dolphins and drafting a quarterback in the first round of the NFL draft. And Michael Penix is a name that's frequently brought up, whether it's from Joel Klatt or from anyone else on the Fox News programming. What I would say is this. With where the Dolphins are aligned as a football team, drafting a quarterback with one of your premium picks flies completely in the face. Now, if Caleb Williams is somehow on the board for you, yeah, I think that would change the conversation quite a bit, particularly if a quarterback contract extension with Tua is not done. But that's not going to happen. So now you're talking about QB4, QB5 in this draft class. And Michael Penix in particular is one that's particularly confusing to me. Michael Penix's strength as a player is throwing to the perimeter and throwing down the field. And I'm sure the assumption with Michael Penix is the 20-plus yard balls are a really good strength of his. He likes to throw vertical passing. The Dolphins have vertical passing speed. It's a match made in heaven. Well, no, not really, because the vast majority of Miami's offense is the timing stuff in rhythm and the quick passing game and setting up yards after catch, which is not Michael Penix. And I think his delivery is long. I think his accuracy, particularly in the shorter areas of the field versus the longer bucket throws. This is the mark, and he's not particularly strong throwing middle of the field versus throwing outside the numbers. It's the Justin Fields thing all over again. That's a player that has his strengths are in conflict with where the Dolphins have invested in their offense. No, thank you. Drafting a quarterback early for Miami at this stage for me makes 0 sense. Drafting a running back makes 0 sense. And a lot of that has to do more so with the draft class in general. This is a very weak draft class for the running back position. I think that's another spot that I would X out on the first 2 days. Now, if you get into day 3 and there's a really intriguing guy at any position, you're going to have a hard time for getting me to not like the pick. Because day 3 is all about tools and upside and developmental players that have the things that you can't coach. And that's where, you hope your coaches can get your hands on guys. You have stability within your organization, some consistency with your scheme and the messaging to the players, and guys can develop. Draft and develop requires stability for that to be the case. The Dolphins are kind of lingering on the edge of having enough stability as an organization to have a realistic expectation that they can start to do that with some consistency, which I'm a fan of. Wide receiver, obviously you have Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill. The Dolphins are telling you that based on their track record of investing, not addressing, investing in the wide receiver position, that, even go back to 2022, right? When it was Channing Tindall and Eric Ezukama, and Eric Ezukama was a bit of a surprise pick. They're like, really? We picked a wide receiver? Well, now they're kicking on Odell Beckham's door. They've traded for Tyreek Hill. They used a first-round pick on top 10 pick on Jalen Waddle and used an extra first-round pick to get in position to draft him in the first place. They invest in this position. This is a position that, in my mind, should absolutely be on the table for the first 2 days of the NFL draft. Tight end, we've already gone into length with. Brock Bowers, I think, is a player that would be the exception to the conversation because of all of the multifaceted ways that he can contribute into your offense and be a little bit of a wide receiver and be a little bit of a tight end and be a little bit of a move piece and have angular blocking at his disposal. And he's a really good run after catch athlete and really rare athlete for a player of his stature. Brock Bowers, I think, should be on the table. But if you get past Brock Bowers and I look at the rest of the players in this class, be it Jatavian Sanders or anybody else, I just think there's too much overlap with what you've already brought in to try to address. Now you get into day 3 and Theo Johnson's on the board, like, okay, from Penn State, draft him. This is a day 1 and day 2 conversation for me. Offensive tackle, the Dolphins have proven that they like to invest in offensive tackles. Teron Armstead contract, the Austin Jackson investment. You go back to 2016 with Larry McTunsil when they drafted him and they had other needs at the time. You have to have a Teron Armstead succession plan. I think the bonus for Miami would be a guy who could play guard in year 1 versus a guy who is just a tackle player. I think there's right and wrong answers for those kinds of players that we will obviously get into. But I think offensive tackle should totally be on the board for Miami, particularly if the guy is capable of shuffling around and playing inside. Case in point, Armstead got the investment that he got. Austin Jackson got a contract extension. Lester Cotton's on the roster for $1 million this year. Robert Jones signed a one-year, $1.8 million contract extension. Isaiah Wynn's back for 1.5. Like they really don't have investment in the other rooms or in the guard room, which is why for me, guard is a position that I don't think that they would draft. So if you're looking for an interior offensive lineman, that's where it gets weird. Is you've given Aaron Brewer a contract at 3 years, $21 million. That seems to be you're invested in him as a player. And Aaron Brewer, I want to make sure I get his name right, did not disclose that he is definitively locked in as the center when he did his introductory press conference. But I look at Brewer's strengths and weaknesses as a player, and I think if you were to draft another center with the intent of moving Brewer to guard, I think Brewer's strengths and weaknesses are significantly hurt. And even if you use a first-round pick on the other player, the 3-year, $21 million contract to Brewer feels like a bigger investment. It's a bigger financial investment for almost the same amount of time as a first-year rookie contract. So I would not move Brewer off of center in favor of another guard to put Brewer at guard. I think your ability to pass protect against better pass rushers in 3 techniques and your anchor is more amplified at guard versus center. And I think his strengths are best amplified at center. So he would be a player I would leave at center. Now, if you want to draft an interior offensive lineman, ideally he plays tackle so you can solve the other riddle, long-term riddle you have at left tackle for when the position group that you're invested in, tackle, has a player that's outgoing in Teron Armstead, which this will probably be the last ride for Teron. So that for me is where, like, Jackson Powers Johnson's an excellent center prospect. And I wouldn't be mad at the pick whatsoever. I would be surprised if it's the pick at 21, just based on the contract that they gave Brewer and the team's lack of interest in investing in the interior offensive line outside of middle-of-the-road center investments throughout the course of this regime. Now, you could say whether that ideology is right or wrong, and you could certainly have a long-winded debate about it. But just ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what the Dolphins have kind of shown themselves to be and how they choose to attack their roster composition, which would make it a surprise to me to draft Jackson Powers Johnson because he could play guard at 330 pounds, but he couldn't play tackle. So it doesn't resolve that long-term issue you have in that position room. And drafting him would then move Brewer to guard, which I think makes him a worse player, and you have financially more invested in him in the first place. We was hoping to get through the whole roster here, and that didn't happen. So we're going to get into the rest of the roster here in just a minute, and then we're going to review some of the NFL rule changes that have been passed at the NFL owners' meetings here next on Locked On Dolphins. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney, whether you're betting big on upsets or you're betting on a one seed. It's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with your first $5 bet that wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. The Dolphins' defensive depth chart. The good news is the Dolphins have invested a ton in free agency here. Between Jordan Brooks and Jordan Poyer and Kendall Fuller and Shaq Barrett and Neville Gallimore and Jonathan Harris, Anthony Walker, Saron Neal, a little bit more of a special teams type investment. They've brought in a lot. It seems like they have kind of handpicked, look, we're going to make this defensive coaching staff change. Anthony Weaver's going to come in and be the DC. We kind of know what we want. We're going to have to kind of shotgun shell the interior defensive line position to get enough bodies in here to have some competition to replace Christian Wilkins. You look at defensive interior, and between Christian Wilkins and Zach Sealer, it has been an identifying component of who the team has been. So I would not be surprised if they came back and they drafted this position early, especially if either Byron Murphy II or Johnny Newton is there in the first round of the draft. There feels like some overlap there. They also had Raekwon Davis, who they invested a second-round pick in as well, who's been an outgoing free agent. He landed in Indianapolis. So there's enough investment in this group. They gave Zach Sealer a contract extension for me to feel like this should be on the table, not just because it's a need, but because the Dolphins have been willing to invest in this room, particularly at an appropriate price point, during the course of this brain trust. Edge group's a no-brainer. You go all the way back to Charles Harris, unfortunately. There's been a lot of investment into this room, whether it's the trade for Bradley Chubb, whether it's the drafting of Jalen Phillips. The edge group has been an area for Miami that they have not been afraid to spend capital and dollars at. I mean, they fit the Shaq Barrett contract in here on a 1-year, $7 million contract with incentives for an additional $2 million. And they played some funny money to get in on the books. We went over that yesterday. I think the recovery of both players could be a contributing factor there. But if you told me at pick 21, the best available player was an edge player, I think it should be on the table for the Dolphins to draft, especially as they continue to assess long-term and big contracts and transitioning from certain big contracts into other big contracts and getting ready to pay out new big contracts. Jalen Phillips. What would that mean for Bradley Chubb long-term beyond this season as he recovers from an ACL injury? There's a whole bunch of really interesting dominoes that could fall with an edge player that's added. But I think the entire defensive line should be on the table. Linebacker. This team has never invested in linebacker, and they've invested more in linebacker already this offseason than they have in recent memory. Now, David Long was a good free agent signing, but it was a high-value contract at the time. Jerome Baker was a third-round pick in 2018, who they let walk and added Jordan Brooks, and they added Anthony Walker. I think they're done at linebacker. I think they've already, in the same light of tight end, where they've already added some significant pieces, and then tight end or the linebacker doesn't have a Brock Bowers in this year's class. So I would just cross linebacker off in the first 2 days of the draft. I wouldn't add it. Corner is an area that this team is constantly swinging the bat on. They love to invest in corners. Jalen Ramsey, Xavier Howard, Cam Smith, now adding Kendall Fuller to the mix. I would be surprised if they added a corner just because I think they have a lot of healthy competition between Ramsey, Fuller, Cam Smith, Kohu, Nick Needham. I think they have a lot of bodies, and it seems like they like Ethan Bonner. I wouldn't completely dismiss it, but I would be surprised if it was a pick. I think if they pick the corner, it would be more of a byproduct of their tendencies to feel you can't overinvest in corners. We didn't even mention Byron Jones and that free agent addition. Feeling like you can't, there's no such thing as overinvesting in that position room. They love to invest in corner. But I do think the way in which they have addressed it probably checks the box. And I would not expect it. I think the back seven's relatively done. I'll put corner or safety in that room, that conversation as well. I think they need a fourth body. Maybe you could get away with a young player because you have Holland now in year 4 and Jordan Poyer as a big-time veteran safety who's kind of seen it all. Maybe you want a young player in that third safety spot. I don't think that's a round 1 conversation for Miami. And frankly, I don't know that the value is going to be lined up for safety in the second round either for the Dolphins. So I think you're going to, there's a lot more on the offensive side of the ball between wide receiver, offensive tackle specifically, potentially center, but not really center. And then the defensive line is where I really think you're looking for early contributors. You're looking for positions that the Dolphins have not addressed, but invested in historically with this brain trust. That is where my eyes go. And that is where I think you can expect to see the biggest overlap between what the Dolphins need, what the Dolphins have historically wanted, and then where you go from there in the draft is ideally finding those overlaps in appropriate value points. Now, courtesy of the summary that was put off by the NFL owners meetings, we have approved 2024. This is courtesy of Tom Pelissero. Approved 2024 playing rules, bylaws, and resolutions. There's some interesting ones in here. We're going to just kind of read through all of them as far as what changes have been made and voted for in the NFL owners meetings. Approved playing rules summary by Detroit. Protect the club's ability to challenge a third ruling following one successful challenge. By competition committee to allow enforcement of a major foul by the offense prior to a change of possession in a situation where there are fouls by both teams. By competition committee to include a ruling of passer down by contact or out of bounds before throwing a pass as a reviewable play. By competition committee to allow a replay review when there is clear and obvious visual evidence that the game clock expired before any snap. By competition committee to eliminate a potentially dangerous tackling technique that is the hip drop tackle. What's what Tyreek Hill got hurt against the Titans with. That is now an illegal play. By competition committee for 1 year only to create a new form of a free kick play that is designed to resemble a typical scrimmage play by aligning players on both teams closer together and restricting movement to reduce space and speed and promote more returns. This is the kickoff change where it's kind of a hybrid installation of the XFL kickoff. And they're going to see how that goes. Approved bylaws by Detroit to provide clubs within, and this one's important, provide clubs with an unlimited number of designated for return transactions in the postseason. So Miami was doing the thing all year long where they're looking at guys that are on IR. It's like, well, you got to do the math. Is this guy going to be able to come back or not? You only have so many that you can use throughout the regular season. When you hit the postseason, you are not limited in the number of IR return designations that you can implement. That's good to know. The trade deadline has moved to the Tuesday after week 9. This was proposed by the Pittsburgh Steelers. That is another meaningful shift versus the standard because the later in the season the trade deadline gets, presumably the less compensation for 1 year rentals is going to be moved for players, but also the better idea of whether or not you should be trading or buying or selling at the trade deadline is more defined for you. By the competition committee, permit each club to place a maximum of 2 players who are placed on an applicable reserve list on the business day of the final roster reduction to be designated for return. Such players will immediately count as 2 of the club's total designations. So you can put 2 players on this is on 53-man roster cutdown day. You can immediately designate 2 players to return. They will count against your 8 IR return players for the season. Unless you get in the postseason, then you can go above 8. By competition committee, this is the final one in the bylaws. Expand the standard elevation rules to permit clubs to elevate a bona fide quarterback an unlimited number of times from its practice squad to active list to be the emergency third quarterback. There's no reason any team should ever carry 3 quarterbacks on the active roster. That's what there's no limitations on quarterback elevations from the practice squad to serve as an emergency quarterback. Any 53-man roster projection for any team that now has 3 quarterbacks on the 53-man cutdown is full of nonsense because that rule gives you a ton of flexibility. There were 2 additional rules, resolutions, one by Buffalo, to make injury reporting rules for players who do not travel with the clubs to games away from their home city competitively fairer. I guess more transparency on the injury report. And then by Jacksonville, expands the 2023 preseason trial of providing specific Hawkeye feed in the coaches' booths for the 2024 preseason, full implementation for the 2025 season. Don't ask me what that means. I don't know yet. But hip drop tackles, the most notable ones is passer down by contact or out of bounds before throwing pass is now reviewable. You can challenge a third time if you successfully challenge 1 out of the first 2 challenges. The kickoff change, the hip drop tackle is eliminated. The trade deadline's been moved. Unlimited number of IR returns in the postseason. And emergency quarterback has unlimited elevations to the active roster on game day off the practice squad. Some significant changes here for the NFL, courtesy of the NFL owners' meetings. And we'll see what other news comes out of the end of these owners' meetings that are taking place this week in Orlando. I will be back again tomorrow with some more NFL draft-specific Dolphins content coming your way. So make sure to stick with us. I'm Kyle Krabs. You can keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. I appreciate you guys checking out the show. Fins up. I'll talk to you all again soon.